Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. I still remember that night like it was yesterday. The heavy air, the flickering lights, the smell that stuck to your skin like something you couldn't wash off. It was my first main event, the kind of moment you dream about when you start out. But that night, everything felt wrong. It was in a small, old arena in Pennsylvania, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the state where time had left its mark. The building looked as though it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades, and the air was thick, humid, even though it was freezing outside. There were only a few hundred people in the crowd, but they cheered loud enough to shake the walls. It was supposed to be a stepping stone for me, my big break. And honestly, I was nervous as hell, but excited too. The locker room, though God, that locker room, it wasn't what I had imagined. It felt haunted. The air was damp, like something had been dripping for years. And the flickering fluorescent lights overhead did nothing to ease the strange tension that sat in my chest. But that wasn't the worst of it. No, the worst was the smell. It wasn't the usual mix of sweat, liniment, and leather. This one had something metallic like old blood, maybe something stale. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just nerves getting the better of me. I mean, who wouldn't feel uneasy? My first main event, an arena that had seen more than its fair share of old-time wrestlers. Hell, maybe I was just imagining things. But that's when I saw it. I was sitting on the bench, lacing my boots, trying to focus on the task at hand, but I couldn't help feeling that something was off. A shadow moved in the mirror behind me. I froze. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the reflection was clear. The shadow wasn't mine. It wasn't the shape of anyone I knew either. It shifted, stretching, then curling as though it were alive, teasing me. I jerked around, expecting to see one of the guys playing a prank, but the room was empty. The only sound was the hum of the flickering lights overhead. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe I was just paranoid. It was an old building, right? Maybe there was a draft that made the shadows play tricks. I shook my head and went back to lacing my boots. That's when I heard it. A whisper, soft at first, like a breeze brushing against your ear. But then it grew louder, clearer. You'll lose it all tonight. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs, a wild, frantic beat that didn't belong to me. I stood up too quickly, the bench rattling beneath me, and turned toward the door. The locker room was empty. There was no one there. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. I was just losing it. Nerves. I had to get out there, focus. I had to be ready, but something wasn't right. I took a deep breath and headed toward the ring. The crowd was buzzing, but the air around me still felt thick, heavy with the kind of weight that didn't belong. I could hear the announcer's voice echoing through the arena, announcing my opponent. Let's call him Mike. I've fought him a few times before, always friendly, always professional. But tonight he was different. Mike was acting strange from the moment he stepped into the ring. He kept glancing over his shoulder, looking behind him like he expected someone, or something, there. I could tell it wasn't just the usual pre-match jitters. No, this was something deeper, something off. We locked up in the middle of the ring, but as soon as I laid my hands on him, I felt the same coldness that had gripped me in the locker room. It shot through my arms like electricity, but it wasn't normal. It wasn't human. We were supposed to be building the match, setting it up for the big spots, but every time I threw a punch or took a bump, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me. It was as if the shadows in the corners of the arena were alive, breathing. After the match, we both went back to the locker room, and that's when I saw it. My gear, my stuff, it was scattered all over the room, thrown haphazardly like someone had been digging through it. My bag, my boots, my jacket, all of it was out of place. I had left everything neatly packed before the match, so I knew something was wrong. And then I saw it. The mirror. The steam on it was thick, like someone had been standing in front of it for a long time. And in the foggy glass, written in what looked like a finger swiping through the condensation, were the words, "You've been warned." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands went cold. The room spun, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at those words. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. My legs felt like lead, but I bolted out of the locker room and never looked back. The following year, that arena closed down. It wasn't because of a lack of business or bad luck. No, the rumors were worse than that. They said a wrestler had died in that locker room back in the 80s. He'd been young, full of promise, but one night, he disappeared, vanishing without a trace. His body was found a week later, but something about it wasn't right. Some people said he was cursed. Others swore his spirit had never left that locker room. And maybe they were right. I never set foot in that building again. Not once. And if someone ever offers me a match in a place like that, I'll refuse. Because some things are better left undisturbed. Some things should never be found. Story 2. The night started like any other. A small town house show in Kansas. Nothing big, nothing fancy. Just a warm-up for the real event we had lined up for the weekend. The venue wasn't much to look at. One of those old, worn-out buildings where the walls creak and the lights flicker. The kind of place you don't think twice about walking into. We'd been here before, many times. But that night, something was wrong. It wasn't anything obvious at first. It was just a vibe, something off in the air. The crowd seemed distracted, their attention never fully on the match. They weren't cheering like they usually did, and their eyes kept darting around, away from us, away from the action. I couldn't figure out what was going on. It was like they were looking at something I couldn't see, something that wasn't there. But they saw it. I tried to ignore it. We all did. But the feeling settled in my chest, heavy and cold, like a weight that wouldn't budge. I focused on my match, tried to give the crowd a show. My opponent, Mark, was a pro. He'd been around for years. But even he couldn't shake the unease that hung in the air. As we circled the ring, getting ready for the usual spots, I felt it. A coldness, sharp, biting, brushed against my arm. At first, I thought it was Mark, maybe just a weird angle or something, but no. He was on the other side of the ring. I looked over at him, and I saw it on his face. Confusion. But there was something else too. Something darker. Something he wasn't saying. I tried to shake it off. After all, we were pros. We've been through worse. But then, as I went to climb the ropes for my finishing move, it happened again. This time it was stronger. A hand, ice cold, pressed against my back. I felt the force push me forward. It wasn't Mark. It wasn't the referee either. The next thing I knew, I was crashing to the mat hard. The air whooshed out of me. The audience gasped. Mark, who was supposed to be taking the hit, stood frozen in place, staring at me. His expression was pure shock, confusion. He swore he hadn't touched me, and looking at him, I believed him. The referee looked just as freaked out. His face was pale, ghostly. His eyes were wide, darting around the ring like he was trying to figure out what had just happened. I couldn't blame him. I was doing the same thing. I couldn't make sense of it. My body hurt, my head spinning, but there was something else gnawing at me, deep down, like I was missing something, like something had happened that I couldn't explain. After the match, I wanted to just shake it off. I figured it was just a fluke. Maybe I was just tired, the heat getting to me or something. But as I was heading backstage, I overheard the crew talking. They were serious, their voices low, filled with an edge I hadn't heard before. "They're not taking down the ring tonight," one of the techs said. "Not until morning." I frowned. "What? Why?" "There's someone in there." "In the ring," he replied, his voice trembling. "We saw them, in the center, standing there, staring at us. I thought it was a joke, a prank maybe." I stepped back out into the arena, half expecting to see one of the guys goofing off. But no, the ring was empty. The lights flickered again, casting long shadows across the space. But there was no one standing in the middle. The crew wasn't joking, though. They refused to take the ring down. They said they saw something they couldn't explain. A figure standing still, watching them from the center of the ring. And every time they got close to it, the figure vanished, like it wasn't even real. I didn't know what to think. I was tired, my mind racing from the strange events of the night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, something I hadn't seen, something I hadn't understood. Later that night, I learned about the history of the venue. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The arena had been around since the 1940s, hosting wrestling events for decades. A local historian told me that years ago, a wrestler had died right in the ring. He collapsed during a match, his heart giving out, and he was gone before the paramedics could get there. They say his spirit never left. I didn't believe it at first. I mean, who does? Ghosts aren't real, right? But after that night, I started to wonder. I heard stories from other wrestlers, stories about shadows moving in the corner of their vision, cold spots that wouldn't go away, and whispers that echoed through the arena when no one else was around. I tried to put it out of my mind, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure in the ring, the cold hand on my back, the feeling of being watched. I wasn't sure if I was just shaken up from the weird night, or if something more sinister had happened. I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to go back to that place. Weeks later, when I found out that the arena was being demolished, I wasn't surprised. The owner sold the property to a developer who couldn't wait to get rid of it. I guess he didn't know about the history, or maybe he didn't care. Either way, it was coming down. But as I left town, I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirit in that ring wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the next show, waiting for the next wrestler to step in, and maybe, just maybe, waiting for someone else to feel that cold hand on their back. Because some spirits, I guess, don't rest. Story 3. We were rolling down the highway, the wheels of our bus eating up the miles toward a small town in Texas. It was one of those places that had seen better days, the kind where the street lights flicker like they're trying to hold on to something they've long since lost. I remember thinking, even before we got there, that this gig felt different. The venue was an old school relic, the kind of building that had creaky wooden floors and that musty smell of years of sweat and dust. The kind of place where you could practically hear the ghosts of past shows echoing in the rafters. The lighting system was on its last legs, some of the bulbs flickering in and out like they were struggling to stay alive, too. The crowd? Small, but hungry. They didn't need a flashy arena. They were here for the real deal. But it wasn't the building that would stick with me, no. It was Richie. Richie was one of those guys who made you forget the long hours on the road, the endless miles, and the aching body after each match. He had that energy, that lightness. He was the life of the party, cracking jokes, hyping everyone up, and promising to steal the show that night. He'd been in the business for only a couple of years, but in that time, he'd made a name for himself as the guy who could work a crowd like no one else. His smile was contagious, his laugh loud enough to fill a room, and his charisma off the charts. Tonight's gonna be legendary, fellas, he said as we pulled up to the venue, stretching his arms wide like he was about to embrace the whole town. This place doesn't know what's about to hit it. Everyone laughed, including me. We were all used to Richie's pep talks. It was part of his charm. I didn't think much of it at the time, but as the event started, something felt off. Richie was scheduled for one of the first matches, and when his name was called, there was no Richie. The crowd cheered, expecting him to come running through the curtain, but there was nothing. We all assumed it was just a mix-up. Maybe he was backstage getting ready. Maybe he was taking a last-minute bathroom break. But as the minutes passed, we started looking for him. We checked the locker rooms. Nothing. The bathrooms? Empty. The parking lot? His car was still there, but Richie was nowhere to be found. At first, I thought it was just one of those pranks that wrestlers play on each other. Richie had a reputation for being a little mischievous. Maybe he was hiding out somewhere, waiting for us to sweat it out before he made a grand entrance. But as time dragged on, that thought faded. We searched for him, calling his name, checking every corner of the venue, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. Then it happened. During the final match of the night, when the whole crowd was on their feet and the air was thick with excitement, the lights flickered. The whole place went black for a split second, the kind of blackout you'd expect from a rickety old building. The sound of the crowd murmuring nervously filled the air, and for a moment, it was like everything had stopped, except for the sweat on the back of my neck. And when those lights came back on, there he was, Richie. But it wasn't the Richie I knew. He was standing at the top of the ramp, right where the entrance usually was, just staring at the ring. His body was still, unnaturally so. His skin was pale, almost translucent, as if the life had been drained out of him. I could see the outline of his ribs beneath his shirt, the hollowed eyes that weren't quite right. His hair, normally messy and wild, hung limp around his face, soaked in sweat. But there was something about him that looked wrong. The crowd gasped, and I felt it in my bones. I tried to blink, but the image didn't change. I was on my feet, ready to rush over to him, to grab him by the arm and shake him back to reality. to ask him what in God's name was going on. But before I could take a step, the lights cut out again. This time, the darkness wasn't just a flicker. It was thick, like something was suffocating the air itself. For what felt like forever, I stood there, waiting for the lights to come back on, heart racing in my chest. When they finally did, Richie was gone. He wasn't on the ramp. He wasn't anywhere. The crowd was murmuring now, confused, afraid. I ran backstage, calling his name, but there was nothing. No sign of him. His gear bag was still in his locker, untouched. His car was parked outside, just like before. It was like he'd never even been there. I remember pacing the locker room, trying to make sense of it all. The promoter, a grizzled old guy who'd been in the business longer than I'd been alive, was sitting in the corner, shaking his head. "Something's not right," he muttered. "Something's wrong with that place. It's been haunted for years. I should have known better than to book here." I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but I'd learned something that night. Richie wasn't gone, not really. We never saw him again. We called his family, but they said he'd never made it to Texas. They never heard from him. No calls, no texts, nothing. It was like he had just dropped off the face of the earth. His car remained parked in the lot for days, but Richie was nowhere. Years have passed since that night, but I still hear whispers in the business. Wrestlers who claim to have seen Richie's figure standing at the edge of that ramp, staring into the ring. The shadows behind the curtains seem deeper there now, the air thicker. And every now and then, when I walk into a venue, I catch a glimpse of someone out of the corner of my eye. A man with pale skin, hollow eyes, and a face I almost recognize. It's not Richie, or at least I don't think it is. But there's something about that look, that emptiness, that makes me wonder. Maybe Richie was never supposed to leave that place. Maybe none of us are.